Okay, now here we are back with high stakes testing. But what exactly is high stakes testing? Well, according to your book, it can be a group achievement test. It can be an individual achievement test. Tests that are high stakes are called that because their results have very serious implications. And it can have to do with accountability of the school or the school district. It can have to do with accreditation. It can have to do with funding. It can also have to do with eligibility for that child. So it can go from the student to the school, the teacher, the district, all the way up to the state. Because all student scores are tallied, they reflect on the teacher, then they also reflect on the school when their scores are mixed in with everybody else's scores, and then all of those scores, are mixed in with the district scores, and so on up to the state level and even up to the federal level, because we're also looked at from a global perspective. And so high stakes testing should measure educational achievement rather than as a means to create achievement. Now, what exactly does that mean? Basically, much of our high stakes testing in this country is used to show what we should be teaching instead of what we actually taught. It shows the elitist standard instead of how can we use this to inform our teaching patterns. And it also needs to show how students are achieving what they have mastered. So is that IEP, this is a special ed class, so that's kind of where I look at it from. Is that student, does the IEP show that that student has gained, lost, have they mastered anything? What have they mastered, part or in the whole? So what are some considerations? Well, the IDEA requires that students with disabilities are to be included. They often use it as a measure of accountability. So, all of a sudden, because they are put together with students without disabilities, where does that accountability go? Yes, we do need to have a measure of accountability, but at the same time, we need to use that, within the realm of reality. What we really need to be using high stakes testing for in the global picture is how are programs effective? Now, when students have difficulties being able to manage the idea of taking this test, now what happens? Why is it that this is not a good measure of accountability? Well, one of the reasons is because students who become frustrated or overwhelmed with the high stakes testing format that we use in this country, that is, you have a booklet, you have a bubble sheet, you have to answer the question in the booklet and fill in the bubble sheet. Now, that bubble sheet by itself can be very overwhelming. Plus, the booklet can also be overwhelming because you're just looking at it and they're going, oh my God, I've got to do all of this in how many days? Are you nuts? So, what can we do to give some accommodations to help kids to be able to deal with this a little bit better? One of the things we can do is change the format. So, now, while we can't take a booklet apart, they don't exactly let us do that. But we don't have to give them the bubble sheet as they're doing the test. We can just have them fill in their answers on a sheet of notebook paper. That's going to give them a little bit more familiarity. And so in that way, they're going to feel like, okay, I have some understanding of how I'm supposed to manage this test. And then when they're finished, they can go in and bubble the answers. That also keeps students from Christmas treeing a bubble sheet. And it can really help them to control their response modes instead of checking C off for every question that they don't know. They can draw whatever they want on their lined paper, whereas on the bubble sheet and on the booklet you can't do that. So that's also another accommodation. You can change the setting. Where is it that they're going to take this test? They don't have to take the test in their regular classroom if they're going to do better in a smaller setting where it's a little bit more quiet. What about the time? We can change that too. We can give them as much time as they need. We can say, no, there's no time allowed on these tests that this student is taking. But we can also reschedule it, which is what a lot of schools do. And the reason they do this for a very, very specific reason. Because you need pretty much in a sorry about that, I lost my microphone there for a second. Okay, so when you're in a medium to large size school, you might have a few extra teachers who are able to give the test, but in a smaller school, you have just as many students that you have to give a test to, but you may not have as many teachers available. And so what many schools do is they say, okay, all of the SPED kids or the high need SPED kids, they're going to take their test next week when we have gotten everyone else taken care of. So they do the majority of the population, and they find other things for the kids to do during that week. And then the next week they have ample faculty available to give, whether it's one-on-one, two-on-one, small group, you know, if you need to have tests read to the students, you're going to have more faculty available for that. And so that's why they often change the scheduling up. One of the things that you can't do with an accommodation, you cannot change what the test is measuring. And that goes right along with the title, accommodation. Now remember, an accommodation does not change the curriculum. It merely makes it more accessible. A modification can change the curriculum, it may not, depending on the accommodation. So you need to go back and look at that accommodations and modifications lecture series to get a really good idea of that if you are a little bit confused on that. But an accommodation should also prevent a student's disability from being what's measured. Now I know we've got like half a dozen little gray lines right there that we have to be very, very careful with. Now, how are assessment requirements met or determined during these two processes? That's another thing that high stakes considerations has to do with. The decisions that are made on an evaluation can determine whether or not they are going to be given an IEP, be given services through the 504 process, or whether they don't qualify for either one. So the high stakes considerations, we need to realize that they are very, very serious. Now, students, there are some students who really can't take the assessment. The I-step, they're just not going to be able to manage that. Now, right now, it's been going between 1% and 2%. We leave it at 1% here on the screen, but remember that technically right now it's at 2%, but it really depends on the legislature that we have in Washington at the time as to what it is. It never goes above 2%, never goes below 1%, so it's always someplace in between. But those are the students who may take an alternative assessment. So that the school or the district, it's up to them as to what that alternative assessment is going to be. Now, sometimes you can use a portfolio, you can use performance-based, you can use different types of observations, but you have to have just as much information in that packet, and it probably is going to take at least 3 or 4 times as long to put everything together because that student is not able to do that alternative assessment. Now, students with an ELL rating, or English as a second language, or English language learner, I believe is what the ELL actually stands for, they may require accommodations, but it's to test their content knowledge, not their English skills. So they have to have it in Spanish. And so when we do the reading section, many times they still get that in English, but but then in other states they're going to have that in Spanish, because what we're really looking at is content knowledge. How well do they read? If we want to know how well they read English, then we need to state that in the test. So what are some issues? Some of the research issues. There are concerns about inconsistency of definitions. The federal law requirements, they vary between states, because Illinois does not take the I-step because that's the Indiana test. Now in New Mexico, they've had half a dozen different tests. Just in the 10 years that I was there, we did the Terra Nova. They've from time to time. I know when I was a student myself, everybody did the Iowa. Then everyone across the country changed to the California, and so it really depends on whether or not a state has decided to develop their own test, or if they want to go with someone else's. And that's also a topic of argument, because there are many people who believe that everybody should be taking the same test, and then there are other people who really believe that each area needs to take their own specific type of test. So there's not a lot of standardization between the instruments that are used across the country, and in that there isn't a lot of consistency either. But the conceptual understanding of being able to show what students have learned throughout the year, or show what you know, is the basic purpose of all of the assessments across the country. So statewide assessments are mandatory. They have to be given to everyone except that 1%, and then they're going to have the alternative assessment, and this does include homeschooled children. In fact, they're not allowed to take the test at home. They must come up to the school, their local school, to take the test. And so if they don't take that test, then their homeschool environment will not be approved the following year, generally speaking. And what we're finding is that online and homeschool environments still are not, those students are not scoring as high on the average as most of our public school students. And when you consider that many of our school districts have been on, maybe a state or federal watch list, that is concerning. And also, we down here at the bottom, we've got, that teachers have reported that high stakes assessments have helped teachers target and individualize instruction. Now, that is not to say that we need to be teaching to the test. We need to look and know what's on that test. We need to know the areas that students are going to be tested on, and then teach that area accordingly, but not to teach a specific type of problem because it's going to be on there. If you're going to teach multiple choice questioning, you need to teach open-ended questioning as well, because I know some states do have both types on their tests. So then we want to look at performance-based reading alternative tests, and how can they be scaled to look, so that the statewide assessments have a high level of validity and reliability. And this is very difficult, because when you're looking at those, especially when you're looking at the comprehension tests, you have to have a right or wrong answer. We're still having to deal with, because it's multiple choice, we're still dealing with a certain amount of chance in that multiple choice. Then we have development of alternative assessments. It's very difficult for states to develop appropriate measures. It takes a lot of time. It can take up to 5 to 10 years to actually develop a well-written and standardized state test. Now, you wouldn't think that it would take that long. However, you have to have inter-rater reliability. When you go back to all those issues with the reliability, this is where it's coming from. You have to make sure that it's valid, that it's actually testing what it's supposed to test. And so we have to make sure that we have appropriate questions and that we're working with students that the test is appropriate for. Now, sometimes they practice on campuses, and this might result in that there are certain groups of students that in a school, they might say, keep Johnny home Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, okay? It's perfectly all right. Because every school district is allowed a certain number of absentee rate. It's not advisable. It's cheating, but many districts do it. And so you need to be aware that this does happen, because when those special education scores are mixed in with general education scores, they do tend to, the overall score does tend to decrease. And so many times principals will ask their teachers to see what they can do about keeping Johnny or Janie or whomever home during those testing days, because if they're absent, they can't retake the test. Then another issue is that test items are not comparable across assessments, because different types of disabilities have different outcomes for students. For example, if a student has a reading disorder, say just basic, learning disability in reading, well, is that a processing disorder, or is it actually, a coding? Do they have problem with the coding, as in they have difficulties with being able to actually recognize the letters correctly within a fluent range? But if they have a processing deficit, that means it's going to take them longer. They recognize everything and they can read. It just takes them longer to process that information. So you actually have two completely different types of disabilities within the same category. And so this can be very confusing, and not very comparable across time. So what can we do to get the best responses? Students tend to respond better and perform a little bit better when they're with an examiner who is familiar to them. So when they have their case manager that they should be very familiar with, giving them that test, they're probably going to do better. That also goes back to that rapport issue. Always making sure that we have a lot of rapport built with that student so that they're going to be more motivated to work. Also, we want to make sure that they're able to visit the testing site to become familiar with the environment. So if they're going to be tested someplace other than their regular classroom, say your office, they should already know where your office is, and they should have been in there a few times so they're familiar with the environment. It really helps if the examiner has done some classroom observations so that you can help the student get used to the idea that they're going to be tested. And so that it also helps you know when they're becoming frustrated or distracted in class. Do not overtest the student. Now, you can give them breaks between tests, but not in the middle of a test, because that's completely breaking standardization. So remember, you can break between tests, but not in the middle of one. Make the student feel at ease. You can play a short game. You can draw a picture beforehand. You can just sit and talk before you get started. Let them know how important the test is without making them feel anxious. Now, you don't have to, come up with something that is, this is the most important test in the whole world. They do need to know that they need to do their best on it. But we don't need to inundate them with unneeded information. Reinforce their attempt and their effort, but not correct or incorrect responses. Don't ever tell a student, oh, that was the right choice. No. You can say, good try. Or that really seemed hard for you. But I can see you're really working. You use their attempt and their effort in your response to them, but you don't tell them it was a right or wrong response. And especially young students may enjoy a tangible reinforcer. One of the things I used to do when I was testing really young students was I would have sheets of paper, different colors, and I would say, okay, what's your favorite color? So therefore they already had some choices. They had some control. So they were able to pick out their favorite color, say it was blue. And then I would have a variety of different stickers. Now in the book it tells you not to give reinforcers in the middle of testing. However, with really young children, really helps them to stay focused and knowing, okay, I'm going to get another sticker. Because little kids love stickers. And, so then I would have baseball, football, My Little Pony. I would have just a variety of different kinds of animals and, pretty rainbowy kind of stickers. So I could cover a variety of different tastes and interests with the stickers that I had. So then, with every 3 or 4, it was very random. I didn't give one after every single one. When I first started testing, yes, they got a sticker quite often. But then I would start backing off on it. So by the end of the test, they were actually motivating themselves to get the job done. But you also really, now right here it says not recommended during assessment. I know it says that. It does say that in the book. That's why I put it in there. But it depends on the age of the student as to whether or not you are going to go ahead and do it during